otherwise known as CFAB. We're a charity based in London. We were established in 1955, and we're the UK representative of International Social Service Network, or ISS. We've got partners in over 130 countries around the world, and we specialise in international social work cases that involve the UK and at least one other country, and which involve children who are separated from family members across borders. We're staffed by social workers and caseworkers, all of whom have a specialist knowledge and experience in working on cross-border cases, and two of whom you will meet this afternoon, our lovely Esther and Nadine. And I've just included a slide here with with information on some of the services that we offer at CFAB. So firstly, we run a national advice line that's available Monday to Friday, which can provide you with advice and assistance on cross-border cases. We do have a slide that has all of the contact details for us at the end of the presentation. We're able to assist with various issues, including child protection alerts. We can request record checks, arrange welfare checks and home visits. And we run a number of special projects to support asylum-seeking, refugee and immigrant children in the UK as part of our family reunification service. We can also arrange a variety of assessments via our partners overseas, and it's that process that we'd like to talk to you about today. So I'm not going to keep you any longer. As I said, it's a packed programme this afternoon, so I'll pass you straight over to Nadine, who's going to begin the session this afternoon.
Okay, thank you, Angela. Welcome everyone. So we want to start off the session by really thinking about why we actually need to consider family overseas and consider international assessments. So when preparing for this Lunch and Learn, I came across a quote in a publication from the NSPCC from 2014, which is a quote from a young person talking about the importance of family relationships and how that could not be replaced. And it's for that reason that I really wanted to use it today, because this quote should really apply and does apply to all children that have family overseas. And they also have existing important connections that can easily be lost. How many children have connection overseas really is demonstrated by the following statistic. And the latest ONS figures in terms of births from 2022 shows that babies born in England and Wales had at least one parent born outside of the UK. This figure is up by just over 1% from figures a year before in 2021. The most common countries for countries of origin for mothers and fathers were actually the same. It was India, followed by Pakistan and Romania in third place. And it is well established that the UK is a really increasingly diverse, and with globalization, we encounter children with multiple family connections. For children who cannot remain safely with their parents, it might be necessary to explore whether or not it is in their interests to be placed with a family member outside of the UK. And having looked at diverse families in the UK, there are other reasons of why you might need to consider overseas assessments and overseas families, and that is founded in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. In its articles, it emphasizes that it is a child's right to have their best interests taken into account, that their identity should be preserved, and they should be provided with appropriate alternative care. Of course, the Children's Act also talks about that the upbringing of children should be promoted within their families. And for social workers and other professionals, this will not sound unfamiliar, but the emphasis here really is that this should extend across borders. Oops, sorry, that was one too far. There are other benefits of why we need to consider overseas assessments, in that a child has to the opportunity to remain within their family, which will increase their feelings of identity and belonging. Children placed in kinship care are more likely to have permanent and stable homes, which in turn means they can grow up to enjoy better physical and emotional health, more self-esteem, and better educational or work attainment, as well as building more positive relationships. I will now pass you over to Esther to talk about some key considerations when assessing family members overseas.
Thanks, Nadine. So we've now considered why overseas assessments are important, why it's important to consider wider family. We'll now look at some issues which it's helpful to consider at the point of, or just prior to making a referral for an overseas assessment. Firstly, considering nationality is very important. We need to know the legal rights of both the child and also the prospective carer to remain in the proposed country. Sometimes that we can assume a child is British just because they're born in the UK, and that's not necessarily the case. Also, post-Brexit, British children might face immigration controls in EU countries, even if they're being placed with British expatriate families. We always think it's useful to use tools such as cultural genograms with families as a collaborative way of gathering information about the child's nationality. Is there some issue with the slides not showing? Anybody? It's come up in the chat, I think.
The slides seem to be okay for me, Esther. So okay. I think so if anyone is having a problem again, you might just want to jump out and pop back in again.
Okay. So yes, I was saying cultural genograms can be a helpful way of gathering that information collaborative with the family. In some countries, it's important to note that there might be complications with getting things like residence permits, and that might mean that an SGO placement isn't possible and the child needs to be placed via perhaps an adoption route. This would need to be a different assessment process via a certified adoption agency. The embassy is able to assist with inquiries about entry requirements for a particular country, but where there are uncertainties about a child or a carer's immigration status, you might need to seek some more specialist legal advice from an immigration lawyer who's got knowledge of the particular country. The Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the FCDO, publishes a helpful list of lawyers, and that's included in a resources slide at the end of this slide deck. It's also important to consider that some countries don't allow dual nationality. And this is countries such as including China, India, Japan, and Singapore. So if a child moves there and retains their British nationality, they may face limitations on accessing services such as health or education, or the carer might need to pay for the services. And it's important to consider if that's sustainable for the carer until the child reaches adulthood. Also, you need to consider that if a child keeps their British citizenship, this might mean that they're unable to return to the UK if, for example, a placement breaks down. So it's important that there's clarity around responsibilities for the UK local authority and also overseas authorities about who's going to be responsible for what part of placement support. And so the family know who they can turn to. It might also be helpful with some assessments to assess the contingency carers as well. Another thing to consider early on is consulting with the overseas authority. This can assist both with sharing information between countries around perhaps previous proceedings or involvement with the child, but it also is a way of seeking consent for the placement from the other country. This is really important, that delay can be caused if the consent hasn't been sought. The SGO might not be recognised and the child might not be able to access services in the other country. The 1996 Hague Convention is an important legal instrument to be aware of in this situation, as if a country is a contracting state to the convention, like England, then you need to contact the central authority, who will then establish whether consent is required. They may decide, the overseas authority, to complete their own assessment for this purpose. From CFAB's experience, overseas assessments are not always as detailed. So for this reason, depending on the country, CFAB might be able to provide an additional assessment to explore further aspects of a kinship or a special guardianship assessment. We'd refer to this as being a dual assessment process, and these assessments can run in parallel, fulfilling both requirements for consent for the placement, but also fulfilling the requirements and expected standards for an assessment in the UK courts. Finally, when referring for an assessment, there's information that it's always really helpful for the overseas social worker to have from you. This can include having a clear picture of who is living in the home. And whilst that might sound straightforward, often we're working with multi-generational households. So it's vital for everybody to know who exactly is in the home, who will be involved in the child's care. Often we're not assessing someone in isolation, and it's a family unit who will be caring for the child. Also, there might be a lot of other children in the home, and we need to consider how they might adapt to the child's arrival. It's also, we quite often find that carers don't have much information about local authorities' concerns and actually what the assessment process will involve. So it's vital that, if possible, it's not vital, but if possible, we would suggest that you would complete what we refer to as an initial screening assessment, as this would really helps us to have some background information. If the overseas social worker is the first person talking to the wider family about the concerns, this can be difficult, and it can be hard for them to contradict information they've already been given by the family. An initial screening assessment could be done virtually by yourselves to contact the prospective carers, find out some background information, and find out who would be involved in the child's care, also to inform them about what the assessment would involve. Also, in referral forms, it's helpful for us to have as specific information as possible about the child's individual needs. We need to remember that the social worker overseas is not going to have any direct experience of the child. Also, the prospective carer might not have met the child. And so it's important that the social worker overseas, can consider exactly how that carer is going to meet this child's individual needs, what services they might require, and actually whether those services are available in that country. We do ask for all of the information to be summarised where possible in the referral form. A court bundle can be overwhelming for our colleagues with acronyms and unfamiliar social work terms. When referring to a diagnosis for a child, for example, autism, we need to consider that the understanding of this diagnosis might vary from country to country. Also, the recommended services that another country might offer, for example, for a child with autism, may be very different to in the UK, and access to the services may also be different. Also, we do find that often diagnoses from the UK won't automatically be accepted in another country, and this can cause delay for a child accessing a service whilst they're being reassessed. Often we'll see on referral forms terms such as therapeutic parenting or life story work, which may have been assessed as important to complete with the child or carer prior to placement. These might not be familiar terms or concepts to social workers overseas, or they may have a different understanding of what this means. So therefore, sometimes a joined up approach is helpful, where perhaps you as a local authority might consider what support you can offer to the carer virtually, whilst the social worker overseas is doing their assessment. I am working on a case at the moment in Asia where the mother has been positively assessed to care for her child. However, the daughter is now being assessed in the UK for autism, which wasn't known at the time of the assessment. Therefore, our partner in Asia is supporting the mother by being in virtual sessions with her, with the social worker, to find out more about her daughter's needs, to consider different parenting approaches that might be helpful. And our partner is also doing some research for us around local services that the family can access if the child's placed. I will now pass back to you, Nadine, some more information about the process of obtaining an overseas assessment.
Yes, thank you, Esther. So let's now look at how you might be able to obtain an assessment or other information from other countries. And the key agencies involved in this process are really listed here with a breakdown of who does what, as sometimes I think people are not always sure about the difference between CFAB and the central authority, for example. But let's start with CFAB. And as already mentioned, we are part of the International Social Service Network and work with our partners on a voluntary basis worldwide. And this can be in Hague and non-Hague countries. And I won't detail our services here again because Angela has really done that already. And we will talk about assessments more specifically later on. Obtaining assessments from overseas is also within the scope of the 1996 Hague Convention. There are other Hague Conventions that cover inter-country adoption and child abduction, for example, but the Hague 1996 Convention really is the key one in these types of scenarios. And contracting states to the Hague Convention, which means those that have ratified and signed the Hague Convention 1996, they designate a central authority that liaises with the central authority in the other country to obtain services such as assessments as well, welfare visits, or alerting a country to a child at risk. You could also contact the central authority regarding transferring jurisdiction or seeking consent to place a child in the other country. More information on Hague 1996 can be found on our fact sheet on our website if you're interested to read up a little bit more. You may also have the option of contacting the embassy of the country concerned. Embassies provide generic information on the laws and procedures in their country, but they also, of course, offer assistance and support to their citizens. They can issue visas and passports or emergency travel documents. And if you are working with a British family that is living overseas, then you might want to consider contacting the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, as they might be able to assist. But that really does depend on the circumstances, but it might be a useful resource to have as well. I now want to focus more closely on how CFAB might be able to assist with the assessment process. So again, we have our network members that complete the assessment in the other country, but what is important to note is that they can be charities like us, they can be central authorities, or they can be statutory partners. And depending on who our network partner is, the assessment process might differ slightly. We have a number of independent social workers based in the other country that we work with, some that have maybe previous UK experience. They can provide comprehensive assessments which are informed by the local context. We have partners globally, and not just in Hague 1996 Convention countries, but also in other countries, which means that we are able to offer services in a wider range of countries. We are a very small charity and we charge for our services. So assessments come at a cost that need to be agreed prior to us making a referral abroad. And you would be advised on the fees at the point of making your inquiries with CFAB. All our assessments are completed by workers in the other country, so they are culturally relevant, and it means that carers can be assessed within their local context, within their language and community. Timescales do vary quite significantly depending on the country and who we work with. So again, we are usually able to inform you at the point of inquiry of what those timescales might be, depending on our experience, and give you a more specific time frame once the referral has been made, because there can be quite a significant lapse of time between making the inquiry and actually sending in a referral. You should be mindful that when the statutory agency in the country where the prospective carers live may need to complete their own assessment, and this is particularly relevant in Hague countries, should you later need to seek consent for the placement. We receive a lot of assessments, and they are also, because they are completed in a local context, they vary, but we are transparent about this from the outset and would be able to advise you based on our experience of what you might expect from the assessment coming back. There are other possibilities other than using CFAB or the central authority, and that could be trying to establish direct contact with the overseas authority and liaising with the child welfare services there. Social workers from the UK also do travel to other countries to complete assessments, and we do understand why it happens because of some of the challenges in cross-border cases. But there are a number of issues that you might need to consider, and the main one really is about the legality of social workers practicing overseas. And we've received some feedback, for example, from our colleagues in South Africa, saying that there it is illegal for a social worker to practice without being licensed and regulated by the relevant professional body. So there is a potential risk of a criminal offence. And there are other issues to look at around ethics and risks for a social worker of doing an assessment, the importance of having contextual knowledge. And for that reason, we've also developed a fact sheet that is available on our website. Another method we often see is looking at prospective carers traveling to the UK to undergo an assessment, which is helpful because it allows for contact between the carer and the child to take place. It allows for observations, but we have to be mindful that that is in an environment that might actually be quite different to the actual placement environment. And we have seen real problems for prospective carers obtaining a visitor's visa to come to the UK for assessment purposes. So if this is contemplated, it is really important to maybe start making arrangements as early as possible. Remote assessments really happened a lot during COVID for obvious reasons, but also some post-COVID time. And the challenge here, though, is that it might not capture the local context for the assessment, and it might not be possible for you to verify some of the information or details that are being seen on the screen. So caution really needs to be applied if this is a method that is used in isolation. And one of those methods might be to do split assessments, which means that you have part of the social work assessment is completed by the UK social worker virtually, and some part and certain sections of the assessment process might be completed by a social worker in the other country, which would also allow for local resources, home conditions, as well as the access to services to be considered. There are certain advantages and disadvantages to all of these methods. And as I said, it might be helpful to use more than one method to assess a prospective carer. But it's just important to consider that the way to obtain the assessment is both culturally relevant as well as legally compliant. I would now like to present you with a case example of a case that we've been working on. This is really just to provide you with an example of what can happen in a case and the challenges of working across borders. For confidentiality purposes, the names have been changed and the country is not shared. And also be mindful that, you know, not all details will be available. This is really just a brief snapshot of what happened. But the case concerns Ethan, who was removed from his mother's care because of substance misuse, her mental health, and Ethan's exposure to domestic abuse. Ethan's grandmother was living in an Asian country and was put forward as a potential carer. So the local authority contacted us to complete an assessment. And we worked with our statutory partner in that country to complete the assessment on the grandmother, which unfortunately was negative because of her grandmother's already stretched financial situation and her very limited support network. And there were further complications in the case, in that Ethan's nationality could not be confirmed because his mother was unable to provide certain documents. So the local authority wanted to contact and clarify this with the embassy, and they also wanted to still look at the placement with the grandmother because they felt that more details needed to be explored. But the embassy raised concerns that their assessment, their negative assessment, was not accepted. So they that created some complications, and the local authority decided to commission an independent social worker in that country to complete an assessment and look at further details. The independent social worker's assessment was positive and recommended that the grandmother could care for Ethan. But to ensure that the statutory agency was in agreement, the CFAB received a request for an addendum report to be completed to see whether or not the information available now would change their original recommendations. And indeed, it did. So the assessment, or the addendum, was completed and was positive. But not only that, it also provided additional documents that clarified or allowed the local authority to apply for a passport and to clarify and resolve Ethan's immigration status in the UK. Despite the addendum, and the final decision was for Ethan to be placed under a special guardianship order with his foster carers in the UK, but contact arrangements were made to ensure that there was an ongoing relationship. And we have had that maybe on a few other cases where even if the assessment or the place is positive and the placement is not made, that the details within the assessment allows the child to understand family relationships, their family history, and have that really important link to their family later on. I'm now going to hand you over, though, to Esther to talk about some of the barriers that come up when seeking assessments from abroad.
Thanks, Nadine. As we've touched on, working in collaboration with overseas authorities can create delays that will affect timescales of the case. So although we will tell you a time frame at the beginning for the assessment, we will keep you updated as much as possible during the course of the work as situations do change. We need to remember that in the UK, we have 12 weeks to complete a kinship assessment, and this is the same for our colleagues overseas. However, there's a number of factors which do cause delays. Firstly, a social worker might not be able to start on the assessment immediately. There'll be issues of bureaucracy. As Nadine discussed, our partners are a range of charities, child protection services. So where it's a statutory agency, they will have their own protocols to follow. They might have other work commitments and child protection visits. And just because we've made a referral, it doesn't mean that that will be necessarily prioritised. We do seek to understand how our different partner agencies work and build relationships with them. And that helps us to be able to kind of establish how they work and their availability from the outset to try and give you as realistic a timescale as possible. So that sometimes the court timeframe may need to be adjusted accordingly. Also, a lot of the countries we are working with, or a number of them, are experiencing political instability. This can affect our local social workers' safety and ability to complete visits, or their ability to prioritise kind of our assessments. We do have one partner agency who is a charity, and they've needed to focus on supporting refugees from Gaza, and so have had to have delays in our assessments. Also, factors such as extreme weather or natural disasters, such as flooding in Bangladesh, has hindered at times them being able to travel and complete assessments for us. And as I said, we maintain close contact with them to try to anticipate these issues and let you know early on. There's also the issue of long travelling distances. Lots of our partner agencies will have referrals that isn't in the same location as where their office is based. They may need to fly across the country to get to the visit or have lengthy drives, which will all extend the assessment process. We do try to make a plan with our partners as to how long the journey is going to take, where they're going to be staying, to help them make it as efficient as possible. If it's quite a complex case and there's very long travel distance involved and we haven't worked with the partner much before, then we will seek to try and do a work plan with them to try and help them maximise their time on the ground with the family and ensure all of the necessary interviews and checks can be completed. It's also another factor to consider with timeframes is religious holidays. So in some countries, there'll be extended holiday periods, which are different to the UK. Families may not be available for visits during these times. Also, social workers might be limited in their travel. They may be fasting and so unable to complete visits. We seek to preempt these challenges as much as possible and plan assessments around them to try to avoid any unnecessary delay. Another factor which is a barrier with our overseas assessments is communication. For many of our partners, English won't be their first language. So sometimes we will need to ask that referrals are translated. Also, sometimes assessments might be conducted in the social worker's native language, then written in English, or they may then maybe be translated again. This process can lead to delays, and we found that sometimes, even if translations are made, the social concepts are not explained, and then we can have some miscommunications. We do, in CFAB, with lots of our partners, have quality assurance processes in place, where we will review assessments with our colleagues to, look at things like miscommunication to make sure that when we do get the assessment submitted to you, these areas are clarified as much as possible. Also, in terms of language, often we will have a social worker who speaks a different language to the family they're visiting. So we may require interpreters. This can be complex, particularly if it's in a remote area or if the language is a minority dialect. We can also have issues if we're trying to arrange, if yourselves are trying to arrange an interpreter to be used with the family overseas. We do find that some countries we've worked with, I've experienced it with Ethiopia and with Mauritius. There can be connection issues, there can be issues with connecting on the telephone, and we've had to reschedule visits several times. And that's something else we'll try to make you aware of early on, and it's something else to bear in mind because it can also impact on timeframes. Our social workers overseas can obviously make us aware of availability of interpreters early on. Knowing the language is spoken by family in the referral can be really helpful, so we can try and get the ball rolling straight away. Also being mindful of things like time differences for when we're arranging interpreters, and allowing additional time where there's virtual elements to the assessment can all be helpful. As I was saying about communication, this slide just reflects the different acronyms that we will often see on our referral forms, that many of them will be familiar to us. They might not all be familiar, but you can imagine if you were a social worker overseas trying to decipher what these acronyms mean, but also if you could decipher them, then working out what the social work terminology might mean and actually being able to gain a proper understanding of the background of the case might be quite challenging. And finally, another key barrier is cultural and legal differences. Some children may be returning to a country where they've previously lived, but for others, they'll be going to a completely new country where there's significant cultural adjustments for them to make. changes which could affect their daily routines, their diets, different education systems, different languages. There may also be different cultural norms that need to be considered, such as different ways of showing affection. Sleeping arrangements may differ, social interactions might differ. In terms of sleeping arrangements, we do often find that a child might be expected to share a bed with their parent until a much older age than they would in the UK. A teenager also might be sharing a room with a number of other children, because sometimes it is considered more important to separate by gender rather than by age. Preparing the child for this transition is really important, ensuring they can develop an understanding of what to expect, alongside considering how they will maintain connections with those that are important to them in the UK. And that also all covers including their wishes and feelings in line with their age. The influence of the wider community is also something important to consider that can impact family decisions. We've had cases where prospective carers are quite hesitant to provide details of referees due to fears of the community learning about local authority involvement and possible repercussions around that. Understanding the dynamics is essential, as it might be that this doesn't reflect that the family don't want to engage, or they won't be open with the child about their story. But it might just be, as I've said, for fear of the impact from the community. And so it's important they're using local social workers. They can help us to understand more of the cultural context of the family situation. And they can also help sometimes with transition plans for when the child's moving. Cultural differences shouldn't necessarily prevent placements, as long as there's no identified risk of harm to the child, and so long as the carers are willing to adapt. However, there might be situations where risks in the wider community are identified, for example, where we've worked with children who might face ostracism due to their background or specific characteristics, and that can impact the safety of the placement. We're working across different social work systems. Some countries don't have robust child protection systems, or their system might only cover their own citizens, so that's also important to consider. And also some countries won't be able to complete, for example, record checks, or information from police and social services might take a long time to obtain. But again, our local social workers can help us understand these differences. And finally, legal differences we find particularly around things like laws of physical chastisement. In a few countries that we've worked with, even recently, corporal punishment is still lawful as long as it be considered reasonable and moderate, which is open to lots of interpretation and is something that our social workers overseas will carefully consider with us. We may have situations where carers have agreed to adjust parenting strategies and undertake work with us. However, there's still cultural acceptance of these parenting practices, and also perhaps schools are still using the cane, which complicates the situation further. Addressing these challenges needs careful consideration of cultural contexts, the community, and the legal frameworks to ensure the child's well-being. So now we'll just round up with some top tips to consider for your cross-border cases. Over to Nadine.
Thank you, Esther. I'm a bit conscious of time, so we're not going to spend too much time on this. This is just really a recap on some of the things we've discussed today, and just to see what you should consider as part of the assessment. I won't maybe go through some of them or each of them. Maybe, Angela, I don't know if we have time for questions. Maybe we should skip on to that rather.
Hiya. There's been a couple of questions asked in the chat, but I think if you want to just run through these, then we can send out the answers to those questions, like we said when we send the slides out, because we've only got a couple of minutes left anyway. Yeah, obviously, if anyone does have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. And I have just put a poll up as well about how you'd rate the session, so it would be great if you could just come on and pop an answer onto that as well. Thank you.
Yes, please. So before you go, though, let's just look at the top tips then. And it's really looking at when you first come into contact with families to establish whether or not the child does have family overseas and what their family connections are, which also will help understand the child's nationality and immigration, but you also need to be mindful of the immigration status or nationality of the carer in the other country, because that might inform which assessment or what long-term placement options are available. You should seek legal advice early on, looking at potentially, the process of mirroring the UK court order, or how that UK court order needs to be enforced, because especially orders like special guardianship order does not really travel very well outside of the UK. Once you've identified that there is family overseas, you should look at the process of who is going to help you with that process, which might be CFAB, the central authority, or maybe even the direct contact, but then also thinking about what type of assessment you really require, and whether or not Article 33 of The Hague, in terms of consent to place the child in that country, needs to be sought. Esther, do you want to, handing over to you?
Yes, so these next points are really when you've got to the point you've decided you will require an overseas assessment, some things that it's important to kind of do early on or at the point of referral. So we discussed initial screening assessments. That would be that we'd recommend where possible, particularly where there might be a multi-generational family, or it's a bit unclear, family relationships are unclear, for example, or where you're not sure if the carers have been informed of the concerns. Completing a virtual short assessment with them in order. Sorry, I was just going back to the my slide. Sorry. Yeah, just to be able to provide information about who's in the family and who we might need to be assessing, and whether there's children in the family too. Translating key documents, that might be the referral. We'll let you know if the referral needs to be translated, but there might be also some other key documents you're providing. In terms of acronyms, social work terms, any information that we're providing to our colleagues overseas, we need to carefully consider that it will be able to be understood by them and give them a good background. So trying to avoid and minimise them where possible is really helpful. It's also important to have as much information as we can about child's needs and what support might be required, because then we can liaise with our partners to see actually if that provision is available there, or if that might need to be offered as a joint process with the UK local authority. And finally, in terms of key issues to be addressed, there is a section on our referral where it's really helpful if you can let us know if there's particular issues for this child and family that you want us to consider. Maybe it might be family time and contact arrangements with wider family. There might be particular safety concerns that you want considered, but our partners will be using a standard kind of special guardianship assessment template provided by CFAB. So extra questions for that case are really helpful. I think that's everything.
Yeah, thank you, Esther. I'm sorry that we haven't been able to come to your questions, but just a reminder, as Angela said, we will respond to your questions just by email, really. So you will get an answer to those queries. But you can also, of course, contact us anytime during our advice line hours with a specific question or just general query. We're always happy to hear from you to discuss your cases, and the phone number is just there if you do want to talk to us. And this is just the list of resources that will be available when the slide deck is sent out. It just really leaves us with thanking you for spending your precious lunchtime with us. We hope that you've enjoyed and found it helpful what we were able to share with you today. We are mindful that this is really just a really brief snapshot of all the different things, and we could have probably spent a long time discussing international placements and assessments. But We look forward to hearing from you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so
Goodbye.
much, everybody. And thank you to Nadine and Esther for that amazing session. It was really insightful. So thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.